All right. So again, I'd like to say welcome to everyone. Welcome to the Brave Wives Support Group meeting. And today we have a special guest. Jennifer Jill Schwirzer is going to be with us today. For the since January, we've been reading Jennifer's book, 13 Weeks to Peace. And we've been learning about how to heal our minds and how to heal our relationships through Jesus. And we've learned a lot of things from the principles that Jennifer has shared with us. And it's my privilege to welcome her to be with us this evening for our review. And so she's going to get started. She's going to share a presentation with us, hopefully do a brief introduction maybe about, and just kind of share a few things that I failed to share about her. And so after her presentation, we'll have time for questions and answers. So I just want to briefly introduce Jennifer, but Jennifer is a wife, a mother, and she's a Seventh-day Adventist Christian counselor, author, 3ABN host, and she's also the director of Abide Network. And Abide is where where I had an opportunity to meet Jennifer virtually and online and via email. We've communicated in those kind of ways, and she's been an excellent mentor, you all. And it brings me great pleasure to be able to share her with you because I guess we've been doing missionary work for many years, and my husband and I, we've met a lot of people over the years. And it's very rare to find somebody with so many hats like Jennifer, so many responsibilities and so many talents, but she's reachable and touchable. And that just really touches my heart because I think that's important as Christians, because I've met a lot of people with big titles, but not as big as Jennifer. And she's just really nice, you all. And I think that's important. So it brings me pleasure to bring somebody nice, who loves people, who loves Jesus, and the love of Jesus shines out in her relationships with everybody. So at this time, I will turn things over to Jennifer. And thank you so much for joining us, Jennifer.
It's a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me okay? Thank you for that very nice introduction. I don't have any choice but to be nice. I don't know why getting a degree would make a person, just should make a person mean. I guess people get that way, but it just works out better to be kind to people. And I'm glad you see that. That really means a lot to me. So Anika had asked me to do a presentation for you guys, and I'm happy to do that. I know Anika has been faithfully working away with this group leader kind of. She's a group coach, I guess you'd say, and she's really been working with mostly wives and helping women improve their marriages and so forth. So I'm really excited about that. Anika's been a real blessing to Abide Network. She's inspired a lot of us. She has some unique offerings and is just always a cheerful and upbeat person. So we are so blessed to have her. So Anika had asked me to do a presentation. She said she kind of polled all of you and you got an idea of what you wanted to hear about. And so she said it was life, purpose, and marriage. So I wasn't sure if those two things were supposed to connect, but I kind of ended up connecting them. And to be honest with you, I have been working on some presentations on marriage. So I'm going to be sharing some kind of new stuff with you. Consider yourself my guinea pigs. And I think it'll fit in with the grand sort of schema of what I have planned here. So I'm going to need to be co-hosted so I can show my screen, if that's okay. Anika, do you know how to do that? You're muted, hon.
Yes, I'm going to figure it out. So I'm going to go to
go up to the three dots.
I got it. Yes. Thank you. That should do it.
Okay, good. So let me share my screen. There we are. I'll pull this up and I'm going to expand this and I'm going to back up for a second here. Life, purpose, marriage, and all that stuff is the name of my talk.
Thank you.
So let's start with life purpose. I have a worksheet that I'll be sending you called My Personal Mission Statement. Basically, let me back up a little and just say that all of us need a sense of purpose. I remember when I was brand new to counseling, someone came, they were extremely depressed, couldn't even get out of bed in the morning. And as we walked through their life, we realized that they had entered the field that they entered, professional field. They had a pretty big booming career, but they had entered that field because other people wanted them in that field. They had not heard God's call on their life directly. They had gone by the lead of other people. And they hated their job, just hated it, to the point where they didn't want to get out of bed in the morning and became extremely depressed. As we reviewed the issues and sort of sorted through it all, the individual came to the place where they wanted to go back to school and embark in a new direction career-wise. And as soon as they made that decision, they started to cycle out of the depression. So in many respects, purpose is everything. And not all of us have figured out what we're going to be when we grow up yet. Some of us are kind of halfway through and figuring out as we go. I think I'm one of those people, and Nika seemed to think that it was admirable that I wear so many hats, but really it's because I have some kind of like ADD, I think, where I can't settle on one thing and stick to it. So I'm still a work in progress, and I'm sure many of you are. But, we can all take comfort in the fact that God created us for the purpose of being like him in character and shining out his character to the universe. The Bible says that God made man in his image, male and female, created he them in his image. It says it twice. And that word image is selem in the Hebrew, and it means representative figure. So God created each of us to represent him in this grand schematic drama we call the Great Controversy. And the background where Lucifer apostatized and God had to create an order of being that would witness and testify of his character. And so he created mankind, and then mankind fell into sin, and God sent Jesus to show us what God looked like. But God's purpose still stands. We are still called to represent him, not only to the onlooking universe, but to other fallen individuals in this world. So that's kind of the big picture purpose for humanity. We're all called to represent God's character, but it's going to, like the facets of a diamond, shine through different people in different ways. And so that's what I'm going to get into here, is the nuts and bolts of how to figure out what facet of the diamond am I? What in particular has God called me to? Now, in the book 13 Weeks to Peace, there's a very long worksheet called, or work tool called God's Purpose, God's Plan Life Purpose Statement is what it is. It's very long. What I'm going to be sharing with you today is a shortened version of that. That's really much more direct and to the point. What I've done here is I've identified 3 areas that I think comprise our individual life purpose, the thing that will lead us to do what God has especially called and designed us to do. And those 3 contributing areas are values, gifts, and passions. And it's as we crunch together values, gifts, and passions that we get a vision for what God has called us to. So I want to break those down one at a time. What are values? Values are what we judge as important, the principles and standards that we are committed to, that we live by, that give our life that sense of meaning. We are, as human beings, are innately wired to judge. And so we're gonna find some things wrong and other things right, and some things exemplary and other things less inspiring, and we're going to be constantly judging good from bad. And so this value issue is part of the function of that ability to discriminate between good and bad that is built into human nature. And one of the interesting things that I've discovered in the process of learning about how to create a personal mission statement is that people that have a service orientation rather than just a personal success orientation tend to be more successful. For instance, in corporations where they have altruism. Oh, here we go. Altruism is the practice of disinterested and selfless concern for the well-being of others. It's correlated in scientific research with effectiveness. Altruism fosters prosperity. Companies draw more conscientious employees when they have some kind of driving purpose that means more than just making money and being successful. Altruism in leaders predicts employee teamwork. So a lot of corporations are realizing they have to include these elements even to function as good companies that make money. They include the altruism because of that, because they know it will affect their bottom line, which kind of corrupts it a little bit. But how much more those who want to serve God that are called according to his purposes, those that have heard Jesus' command to go to all nations and teach and baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I mean, how much more those of us that want to follow in Jesus' footsteps, ministering to others, how much more should we be really driven by altruistic values? A little more information about how altruism in corporations is such a benefit. Medical and business students are more altruistic than law students. Female students, from another study, it says female students reported stronger attitudes consistent with altruism compared with males. So women are naturally more inclined to those kind of noble aspirations, at least according to this research. And then African American and Hispanic students reported more altruistic attitudes compared with white students. So companies should recruit more women and minorities. So what are your values? That's one of the questions you ask yourself. Another question you're going to ask is, what are my gifts? What are my talents? Each person is given something from God. Not everybody has the same amount of talent. I think that that's a mistake for us to think that all men are created equal in the sense that everybody has the same gifting and the same advantages. There are some people that have greater advantages than others and greater talents than others. God doesn't care so much how much talent we have. He cares what we do with what we have. And if you remember the parable of the talents, one man was given 5, one was given 2 talents, and one man was given 1. Then the steward went away and he came back. He told them, invest and create revenue from the talents that I give you. And they were to invest this money, and talents were referring to financial amounts. And so he went away and came back and asked them for an account of what they'd done with the talents he'd given them. The man that he'd given 5 talents improved on those talents by investing them, and he presented his master with 10 talents. He had doubled the value. The man with 2 talents did the same. He doubled the value to 4 talents. And then the man with just 1 talent said, you know what? I knew you were a hard man and that you exact from people what you did not give them. So I buried my talent in the ground. In other words, I didn't want you to punish me if I lost the talent or take the money if I did invest it. So I buried it. And the man was very angry. And so God is paralleling this to his attitude toward his children and how he gives us these talents. And those of us that bury them in the ground, thinking that God is a hard man, really do a great disservice to him and to the world. It's very interesting to me that he chose that person with lesser talent to be an example of how not to handle gifting. Because I think people with less talent compare themselves to people with greater talent and consider that an excuse to do nothing. It doesn't matter how your talent level compares with other people. What matters is what you do with what God has given you. And so press forward with that and invest what the Lord has given you, because he's going to be back to find out what you did with it. So gifts are things for which you have a natural aptitude. They tend to be effortless, or at least easy for us. There are people that are so music just kind of flows out of them. That's a gift. And then there are some of us that love music and want to do music, but don't have that much talent. And we have to try really, really hard to be good or master an instrument. Now, one of the questions would be, has God called the person with very little musical talent to a career in music or a lifetime in music ministry? And to that, I would say generally no. Generally, God calls us according to the gifts that he's already given us. It doesn't mean you don't play an instrument on the side, because doing things that we're not as naturally gifted in can actually improve the areas where we're naturally gifted. So we should try to have a well-rounded personality and talent mix and gift mix. But as far as what we're going to do with most of our time, I suggest that one way of knowing what God has called you to is what's easy for you. What are you naturally gifted to accomplish that kind of comes naturally to you, that God seems to have written right on your DNA. But even with that, there is some cultivation required to master a talent. So just the fact that you're very gifted musically doesn't mean you're going to master an instrument. You still have to practice. But start with something that God has given you. Some people just cook so effortlessly. They walk into the kitchen and they dump this and this, and it tastes great every time. You know, there's people that try as they might, everything turns out terrible. And I would say that that former person is gifted in cooking and they're just naturally capable. God is probably leading them to do something with that gift. And the third category is passions, things that make your heart burn within you, things that you feel strongly about. Now, there are some people that feel a certain passion. Maybe someone loves basketball, but they happen to be 5'1". They're probably not called to a career in basketball, though they may love it. So passions are separate from gifts and really need to coincide with gifts to prepare us for a life calling. Passions are things that motivate us, and they often tap into past trauma or difficulty that we've had. I have a friend who's very active in abuse response work in church. She handles sexual abuse cases and helps advocate for victims and so forth. She herself experienced abuse as a child. That, in a very unique way, has gifted her to be able to be very effective in that arena. And so sometimes your passions will tap into an experience you've had. Maybe you've encountered racism. Maybe you've encountered poverty. And maybe that racism and or poverty drives you to take on a burden for advocating for people that are in the same situation. I know I have examples of that in my own life. I've experienced depression, and part of my passion for helping people with depression is the fact that God helped me through depression myself. So what I've done in the, this is not bullet pointed properly over here, but anyway, what I've done in the worksheet that I'm going to send you is I've listed a number of values, and what I ask you to do when you fill out this worksheet is identify 3 of them and then do the same. And by the way, if you've come up with something that isn't in the list, that's okay. There's an other blank. And gifts are another arena. You're going to pick 3 of those, and then you're going to pick 3 passions. So some examples would be values. Do you value beauty? Do you value fairness? Do you value strength? Or maybe you value tradition. Or maybe the most important thing to you is creativity. You identify which are your core values, and then you go into gifts. What are you really naturally good at? Maybe you're just a natural poet. I know my mother was very good at rhyming. She would write poetry for people's birthday parties, and it was just very well crafted. She never got into it seriously, but I ended up writing songs and performing songs for many years in my adult life, and wrote the lyrics of the songs. That's something that comes naturally to me. The ability to rhyme and to be able to fit words together well really works quite naturally. It's a natural gift that I have. Let me look. I'm not gifted with math, although I've had to do my own books for my nonprofit corporation, and I've gotten better at it, but I almost flunked out of math in elementary school. So we're going to have different gifts, different aptitudes, and you identify 3 of those, and then you're going to identify 3 passions. Oh, do you love to help the needy? Maybe you love to just reach out to lonely people. Like, that's a really valid ministry, is just ministering to the lonely. Maybe you really have a burden for education and you want to promote education. Maybe you want to work for the cause of civil rights. You know, God will light a fire under you for certain things. I want you to identify those things. And then once you choose 3 each from each category, then you create this personal mission statement, and you'll see how it's done when you look at the worksheet. So you're going to have from the motivations of blank, blank, and blank, and a passion for blank, blank, and blank. I will use my gifts of blank, blank, and blank to change the world. And you might be thinking, oh, this is silly, but you're actually going to discover things about yourself when you do this worksheet. And let me say, do it on paper. Don't just do it in your mind. When you do things involving your senses, tactile, visual, and all of that, it's going to engage more with your mind in meaningful ways. So go ahead and print out. I will send you the worksheet printed out, and then do it on paper. All right, I want to talk to you about marriage. The way that marriage ties into life purpose is that I really think that we need to know who we are as individuals before we get married. And a lot of trouble comes to a marriage when people don't. We should be relatively mature. Now, obviously, you can't be very mature when you marry because you typically marry at the young end of the life spectrum, but you should know something about who you are and what God has uniquely fitted you and called you to do. And that should be the basis for which you come into this alliance we call marriage with another person. Because if one of you is called to be a foreign missionary and the other wants to be a world-renowned plastic surgeon in the United States, make a lot of money and support other ministries, you're not really compatible. Your life callings are not compatible. So your life purpose, the thing that you feel called to, as undeveloped and partially there it might be, you need to know that so that you know who you would match with. So that is how personal mission or a sense of life purpose connects to marriage as I see it. And even once you're in marriage, it is very important that you retain a sense of individuality. So I want to share a little talk with you that I've put together on marriage and how it works. So as I see it, marriage involves kind of a paradox or a balance between individuality and intimacy. You have to maintain both of these things to have a healthy marriage. So individuality would include a sense of personal freedom, sovereignty over one's own body and mind. Nobody can dictate to you what to think, and nobody should force you to in what you do. You need that sense of sovereignty. Personal agency. I can make choices. I have options, the ability to choose, and then clear personal boundaries. This is not something I feel comfortable with, so I have a boundary there. That all of those things are individuality. And then intimacy is a sense of being connected, of joining one's body and or mind to another, of collaboration, the partnering of wills, and the yielding of personal boundaries. So there is some yielding of boundaries, or maybe preferences would be a better word, in intimacy. And it's really hard to figure out where that line is where you should not yield, because you do yield things, and you should in a marriage yield. Both partners should yield. Collaboration, a good example of that is children. Raising children, you're going to be doing it collaboratively. No one parent can do it as well alone as two parents together. So keeping the balance between individuality and intimacy in marriage is really a task, because individuality means we stand alone as separate individuals. Intimacy means we join ourselves and we become one, a separate entity kind of, as two individuals joined together. The Bible expresses this by saying the two shall be one flesh. So what happens is we go back and forth between those two things. And there are certain stages that are fragile, and there are certain fears that we struggle with in the process of going in and out of individuality and intimacy. So the two basic fears that have been kind of conceptualized in scientific research, the attachment-related fears, are avoidant, which is the fear of losing individuality. I fear of losing my personal autonomy, and so I'm going to avoid that intimacy. And then anxious is the fear of losing the relationship. So both of these relationship styles involve the fear of something, the fear of one of the two parts of the paradox, or the two parts of the balance. It's very interesting to me. I did a little bit of research on males and females in marriage and their attachment styles. Men overall tend to be more avoidant in their attachment styles. They're more afraid of losing their individuality. And women overall tend to be more anxious in their attachment styles, fearful of losing intimacy. So women will often compromise their individuality in order to retain the relationship. They'll take responsibility for things for which they are not responsible to maintain the relationship, because we are so relationally wired. Men, on the other hand, will guard their individuality more vigilantly overall. Now, it's very interesting to me. Paul said in a couple of different places, men should love their wives and women should submit to their husbands. And then he used the term respect for how women value their husbands and love for how men value their wives. Why did he use the different language, the different emphases? I think it may have to do with the overall attachment style. Men, as a rule, are more afraid of losing their individuality, remember. And so which type of love or positive regard can you give that will, as little as possible, threaten that sense of individuality. That would be respect. Really valuing the individual as an individual. And then for the other partner who's more concerned about losing intimacy, how could you approach that partner in a way that would make them feel maximally secure? That would be loving or having affection for that partner. So I think why God said in his word, women respect, men love, is not so much that in every case the men are more afraid of losing their individuality and the women are more afraid of losing the relationship, because it really isn't that way. It's not straight, it's not categoric, but it tends to be that way. And God wanted to hit as many people as he could with the right advice. But both men and women in marriage need love and respect. So don't think that these things are all or nothing. I remember conducting a choir, and I had about 20 people in the choir, and they were all really looked down and out while they were singing. They were like, "Oh, that would be joyful, joyful, joyful." They just didn't have any expression on their face. There were 3 people in the choir that looked like they were having a manic episode. Big smile, just totally lit up. I had to make a hard call, and I would say to the whole choir, "Smile." And of course, the people that already looked like they were having an episode would smile even more, but it wasn't really possible for them to smile more, so they would still try. But the rest of the people would smile. I was trying to hit as many people as possible with the right advice. And I think that's what Paul was doing. Not to dogmatize that all women ever need is love and all men ever need is respect, because both sexes need both in a marriage, but to try to help hit as many people as he could with the right advice that would help them start to approach marital intimacy in a way that is as least threatening to the partner as possible. So the fragile stage in connecting is that fear of loss of individuality. When we come into close intimacy with our partner, we're going to be a little afraid. I was free a minute ago, but now, I'm not as free because I'm connected to this other person. And then the fragile stage of disconnecting, often we encounter that loss of intimacy or a fear of loss of intimacy. So it's very interesting. Marriage is like a dance. Now, I want to give you just another short talk here about how to draw the line when perhaps what you're going through is not marital conflict necessarily, but possibly abuse. Now, I pray that this is not true of any of you or for any of you, but you may be ministering to others that you need to have this clear in your mind for. So let me just give you a little background on the marriage counseling field. There are kind of 2 different schools of thought when it comes to how to deal with conflict in the marriage. There's a very feminist-oriented school of thought, and then there's a marriage counselor, classical marriage counseling, and they often have different agendas. And this has been a big thing in the behavioral science field, and particularly marriage and family therapy. The feminists tend to want to stop abusive men. Now, in marriages, overall, men are more often physically abusive if there's abuse in the marriage. I think male and female are basically tied, with possibly women coming out ahead in perpetrating emotional abuse. That's interesting. But what the feminists really wanted to do was stop domestic violence, where men were beating their wives and women were staying in the relationships. So the feminists wanted to stop abusive men, but marriage counselors wanted to save marriages. And this created conflict, because as soon as a man raised his hand against his wife, the feminists just wanted a divorce and to get that woman out of there. And the marriage counselors wanted to say, well, maybe we could work with this marriage and save it. So the $1 million question is, what if the marriages are to abusive men? What should we do then? So I want to share with you a spectrum of marital problems. I would say there are 3 basic categories, and there's going to be some bleed over between these categories. Don't think they're absolutely discrete, but I would separate them out into these 3 categories. The problems are either going to be conflict, they're going to be cycles, or sometimes they're going to descend into cruelty or abuse. So conflict is the common denominator in all marriages. You can't try to blend your life with another human being without having conflict. There's just no way. One person likes everything perfectly neat, and the other one could care less and walks water all over the floor after their shower and leaves their socks on the floor. And that's just how the person was raised. They just didn't have that clean of a house, and the other person had a pin perfect house. And so there's going to be conflict. What about spending styles? It's going to present some conflict in marriages. So there's going to be conflict. Don't expect the conflict to ever go away. 69% of marriage problems never really totally resolve. What we've found, though, is that they may not totally go away because that person's always going to be more of a neatnik than the other one, but the partners can learn how to talk about the conflict in a way that draws them together into a healthy relationship rather than driving them apart or creating conflict. So I'll give you an example. My husband, we get in the car, drive down the road to go to church, and he never puts his seatbelt on. And a block or two away from the house, the alarm will start ringing, ding, ding, ding. And it bugs me. I can't listen to that all the way to church. And so without exception, I'll say, can you please buckle in? Plus, I don't want my husband driving without a seatbelt on. Well, one day I realized that I was just reminding him every single time. And so I decided to talk about the fact that this was happening. And I said, hey, Michael, do you notice that like every time we get in the car to go to church, you don't put your seatbelt on, even though you know that's something that's really important to me? Have you noticed? Do you have any thoughts about that? And we had a fairly intelligent conversation about the fact that this happened over and over again. And I dare say that it did sort of help a little, maybe. I'm not absolutely sure of that, but at least we had a pleasant conversation about it and it didn't end up escalating. It was not a life or death issue. It was not something to file divorce over. It was something we could just talk through, and we did. So that's conflict. There will always be conflict, but then sometimes cycles develop. And the most troubling cycles are escalative cycles where people get angry and they fight with each other, often with shouting, throwing things, sometimes even physical encounters. When you measure marriage couple by married couple and take a broad, population research type survey, the amount of physical encounters is going to be equal roughly between male and female. However, what's going to be more male is actual injury caused. For obvious reasons, men are bigger and stronger than women, and so they're more often going to cause physical injury in a physical encounter. But women apparently escalate as much. And I would call, that type of thing where people get physical or shout or throw things a cycle, and it's unhealthy and it's dysfunctional and it needs to be resolved, but it's not the same as cruelty. Cruelty is where one person, I have to be careful how I explain this because it's not always just one person on the other, but a classic abusive relationship is where one person is cruel, harmful, and exploitive to the other, and the other is innocent. That's a classic presentation of domestic violence. Sometimes people abuse each other, and that's the reality of it. So in my years of counseling, I have counseled couples where I would consider it going both ways. But it's not uncommon for it to go only one way, and that's a situation that we need to pay special attention to. What I generally say to couples as I work with couples in these first two categories, and let me just go forward here. Conflict and cycles need what I call a workroom, and cruelty needs a courtroom. To get help, couples need the right room. So I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, but here you see it in illustration form. Conflict, you need a workroom approach. Cycles, you need a workroom approach. Courtroom, real cruelty, you're going to need a courtroom approach. So let me back up and explain what I mean by that. A workroom is something that improves a relationship. So in a workroom, I do not try to assign blame to one person or the other. This is not a courtroom. And as a marriage counselor, I will try to keep people from trying to blame someone because it's got limited utility, blaming. Apologies are spontaneous in a workroom. They are attunement based. You tune into what the other person needs, and you try to get the partners to tune into each other. There are plenty of redos in a workroom. If something goes wrong and it's exasperating or painful or uncomfortable, a person can always say, let's do that over, and you can redo. Workrooms are collaborative, people working together. We call it couple work or joint therapy. And you can do coaching where you coach people in how to improve their relationship. In a courtroom approach, you're going to assign blame. There's going to be apologies required. It's going to be very accountability based. There needs to be clear repentance. You don't just redo, oh, let's try that again. That was a faux pas. You're going to have to see clear signs of repentance if someone has abused you. You're going to work with the individuals involved. You're going to help the person that's being abused to have boundaries and limits and find a safe place. And you're going to work with the individual who is perpetrating the abuse to deal with his issues or her issues. There's going to be individual confrontation in that approach. There's going to be individual therapy, and there's ultimately going to be advocacy for the individual being harmed. So how do you know if you're in a situation in your marriage where you need a courtroom approach? I would make it very simple and say any of the 3 A's, abuse, adultery, or abandonment, there needs to be a courtroom approach. You've been treated wrongly by another human being. It's not just a matter of helping the relationship function better. There is clear sin going on in one person's life toward the other. Here are some questions you can ask yourself to know if you're in an abusive relationship. Have any kind of sex, including porn, has either partner had any kind of sex, including porn, with others, or are they having any kind? Does either partner purposely deprive the other of sex, force sex on the other, physically harm or threaten harm to the other, destroy the other's property, insult, taunt, or mock the other verbally, belittle the other publicly or to children, repeatedly accuse the other without evidence, engage in subtle emotional abuse patterns? Here are some of the examples of abuse, emotional abuse patterns, which can tend to be very subtle. Stonewalling, starving the other for communication, monstrifying, seeing evil where there is none, falsely accusing of lying or inconsistency, gaslighting, leading the other person to doubt their sanity, minimizing regarding serious issues lightly, got drunk, banged up the car. Oh, no big deal. It was an old hoopty anyway, Hey, you could have killed someone. You could have lost your life. Third party referencing a non-present person. Oh, so-and-so feels this way about you. Paranoia, raising suspicion of other people. Saviorifying, claiming to be the other's lifeline. Without me, you would never make it in life. Backbiting, prejudicing others through false reports, talking to other people about your spouse in a very derogatory way, just for the sake of harming their reputation. Exposing, sharing the spouse's private information. So those are some emotional abuse patterns. Emotional abuse is defined by severe patterns of harmful behavior versus occasional unkindness. So it's not about the occasional deed or misdeed. It's about the trend of the life. So I know I've just thrown a lot of information at you, and I did tell you were my guinea pigs, and I'm just still working out the details of this marriage presentation, or these parts of this marriage presentation that I'm going to be doing. But I hope there was something in there that was helpful to you, and maybe we can have a little Q&A or dialogue.